Hey, hello Bio2. We're continuing on with Chapter 30, and we're getting to our second group of vertebrate animals. The ones that kind of came next after our fish are amphibians. So hopefully we might know just a couple examples off the top of our head what an amphibian is. If not, we're going to sure find out here pretty quickly. So first off, we got to figure out what is an amphibian. So the word amphibian comes from the word amphibia, which means having two lives. So for amphibians, they can live on land, but they are never completely free of water. So just quick examples, so we know what we're talking about here is basically frogs, toads, and salamanders are the main groups that you've probably seen around here that fall into the group of the amphibians. And so what makes an amphibian is that it is a vertebrate that, with some exceptions, again, there's always exceptions to these rules, but for the most part, these are the main characteristics of an amphibian. So they live in water as a larva and on land as an adult. They breathe with lungs as an adult, and they have very moist skins that contains mucus glands, and they lack scales and claws. So for the most part, these are the characteristics of all amphibians. Again, there's always exceptions, but these main four things are what you're going to need to know on what makes an amphibian an amphibian. And so now we're going to look at how are amphibians adapted for life on land, again, because they came from a vertebrate ancestor somewhat similar to the fish. So how did our first animals actually make it to life on land? So the first amphibians, they appeared in the late Devonian period, around about 360 million years ago. So remember, Devonian was when the fish really took off as well. And so then this time as well, around the end of the fish, where some of the fish maybe tried to move on land and became and developed the amphibian groups. So the transition from water to land required that terrestrial vertebrates had to do several things. So again, terrestrial meaning land. So in order to move from the water to the land, you needed to breathe air. So that's kind of an important jump that needed to be made. They need to protect themselves and their eggs from drying out. So most fish, they can kind of just lay eggs underneath the water. The water keeps them moist. They don't really have to worry about them drying out. So that's kind of a challenge they had to overcome. And they also just had to protect themselves from drying out. And they had to support themselves against the pull of gravity. So water, really, they can kind of just have a free-floating body there. Doesn't kind of keeps everything held together. When you leave the water, your body needs to be able to hold itself upright. It can't just kind of flow around in the water and use the water for support. So those are three big challenges that our first amphibians had to overcome. And so our early amphibians, in order to kind of, again, solve those problems, they evolved several adaptations that helped them live at least part of their lives out of the water. So the first one, they had bones in their limbs, and they had limb girdles of amphibians that became stronger, that permitted more efficient movement. So their bones just kind of developed in order to help them move better. And then they actually developed lungs and breathing tubes that enabled them to breathe air, so they didn't just have to worry about breathing water, so they could actually breathe air. And then the sternum formed a bony shield to support and protect their internal organs, especially the lungs. So those are some big adaptations that helped them survive on the land. So here's just kind of, again, some more adaptations. The leg bones. So the legs of land vertebrates must be strong enough to hold up the weight, again, because the water can't support them. And their skin, the skin and the lining of the mouth cavity of many adult amphibians are very thin, richly supplied with blood vessels. And then watery mucus is secreted by glands in the skin. And we've mentioned before that some animals will breathe or respire through their skin. Amphibians are huge at respiring or breathing through their skin. And in many adult amphibians, the internal surfaces of their lungs are richly supplied with blood vessels and folds that will increase its surface area. So the more blood vessels there is, the more exposure, the more surface area they can have, the more contact they come into with the air, they're able to absorb more oxygen. So that's a good reason why they have such a large surface area and why there's so many blood vessels, so they can kind of obtain as much oxygen as possible. And so that's kind of how the amphibians came along. So now again, we're going to look at the form and function, what they do to survive. So our first thing is feeding. So a tadpole is just the name for any of the larval stage of invertebrate. So we can just typically refer to those as what we see as the baby frogs swimming around, but salamanders have tadpoles, toads have tadpoles as well. And when they're in the tadpole stage, they're typically filter feeders or herbivores that graze on algae, and their intestines will help break down hard-to-digest plant material that are usually filled with food. And the feeding apparatus and digestive tract of adults are meat-eating structures. So that's what we're going to look at next, is kind of the adult digestive system and that kind of helps them to be meat eaters, because as tadpoles, they pretty much just graze on algae. So when they become adults, they look something like this. Again, this is a frog, is just an example. So we're going to look at the digestive structures, is going to be the first thing that we look at in the frog anatomy. So adult amphibians are almost entirely carnivorous, so they eat meat, almost every single one of them. And many salamanders and frogs will have long, sticky tongues that are specialized to capture insects. And so once they do capture the insects, we're going to again use the frog as an example to see how the process of digestion works. So in a frog's digestive system, food slides down the esophagus, so obviously enters through the mouth, slides down the esophagus and into the stomach. So that's the first step again. One-way digestive tract, a lot of specialized regions. Then the breakdown of food begins in the stomach and it continues in the small intestine. And then the liver, pancreas, and gallbladder, so these are all three different structures all labeled there. They secrete substances that will help aid in digestion, so those organs will help break down different foods that are eaten by our amphibians. And at the end of the large intestine is a muscular cavity called the cloaca, and through this, digestive waste, urine, and eggs or sperm will leave the body. So this opening right here serves several functions for the frogs. It can help them eliminate waste and also aids in reproduction as well. So that is, again, the specialized regions that help the frog carry out digestion. And it's similar in all amphibians, but the frog is kind of just one easy example to look at. And so for breathing and respiration, in most larval amphibians, gas exchange occurs through the skin and the gills. So that's, again, we've said that before. And adult amphibians, however, they typically respire using their lungs, but some gas exchange occurs through the skin and the lining of the mouth. And since they do breathe through the skin, frogs are actually a good environmental indicator of how if a stream or something like that is polluted, one of the first animals to go is the frogs, because they take in so much things through their skin. So that is just kind of a fun fact for you to end this video. So that's it for our first section about amphibians. Let me know if you have any questions.